or immediately after, but it does grow. And compared to the South, which basically collapses, looks pretty good. Political, we have the reunification of the Union and the Confederacy. That's the main object of the war. So, we achieved this, the Union survives. This is why Lincoln is considered the greatest president in the history of the United States. He basically saves the Union from collapse or breaking up. The elimination of slavery, we have those civil rights and legislative amendments. On the downside, but, however, when you look at the South in the longer term, past the Compromise of 1877, we have the reassertion of these Redeemer governments. We have Jim Crow laws, terror, resegregation. African Americans are denied the right to vote with grandfather clauses. That is, if your grandfather wasn't free, you can't vote. Or poll taxes, you have to pay money to vote. Those things are, I would say that Reconstruction is a failure. Your book and the modern interpretation is that Reconstruction was kind of a success. Because they look at this black Reconstruction. Now that's a very modern, that's part of the revision of Reconstruction history. That they're trying to rehabilitate Reconstruction and make it sound, and look at the Freedmen's Bureau and the people who black participation in the political system and some of the successes and say, well, it wasn't a complete failure. But my thing is the big picture does not really look very good in the long term. So the consequences of war, you're going to deal with economic and political. Okay, if you haven't got one of these, grab one of these. Go take a little break in the lawn. Know the Turner thesis.
Does he say that we've taken all the frontier, or that we're done on it? He called the frontier.
He says that we no longer have a frontier.
Oh.
He's talking in the 1890s. The frontier is gone now. And actually, remember, the frontier is gone in the 1890s, but in 1898 there's the Spanish-American War. That's the moment at which the United States becomes an imperial power and goes oceanic.
What about Alaska?
Alaska's bought in Civil War, right?
I know, but it hasn't really been totally discovered, and so.
Yeah, you could say that today that Alaska is the final frontier, in a way.
Somehow safe.
Yeah. Well, on this planet. Yeah, democracy, individual. Everything what is American? Okay. The West, you need to understand, is a region, and they can ask you questions about railroads, cowboys, miners, and ranchers. I'll show you some maps that do that. You got to remember that the Homestead Act was passed during the 1860s. Not sure the exact year, 62, 64, 60, whatever. But that's basically passed during the Civil War. Southerners don't like the Homestead Act. The railroad goes across the north. So during the Civil War, we're seeing these, big economic programs being initiated. But we could never, with the South gone, we also passed this National Bank Act. Could have never passed that with all those states' rights, Southerners. There is another counter-Turner thesis out there, and how far they probe you on that. Usually they put you like a generation behind in historiography in a U.S. history class, high school. They want you to know stuff that was, 1980s at best. So they may not press you too hard on this other interpretation, but I'll just mention it. And then environment is the new hot topic also about West. Remember, the West is an arid zone. The West, in terms of agriculture and in terms of development, is something that has been created by the federal government through massive irrigation projects. So when you see the Newlands Act, or you see different acts where you're basically creating dams and irrigation, the Westerners love to think of themselves as rugged individualists. Their entire environment is totally artificial, right? Farming in the West should never happen, right? The frontier thesis, it's continuous recession. This is his thesis at the end of 100 years. The frontier is gone, and with it is gone the closing in the first period of American history. We're at a turning point. Now, there's a lot more to it that's in this. They usually ask you about questions about democratization, individualism, lots of stuff that we think about as typically American, like, I can remember John Wayne movies. Maybe you're more familiar with Clint Eastwood, but, Dirty Harry lives by his own code, right? And the idea of America, making up your own mind, this kind of rugged individualism is part of the West. Part of this culture, this mythology that we've created about the West. So this sense of and we've sort of internalized this identity, which is pretty much totally fictional, but it's nevertheless real. Now, the other thing I would just point out, in passing, the West has a lot of, a lot of beautiful lands. We need to get through here, guys. Need to make room. Spaces. The West is actually the most highly urbanized area in the country. Most people in the West live in cities, and actually, this is proof of that. This is not where people live. The West is a very highly urbanized area. And farming in the West, highly mechanized. So, the whole cultural image we have of the Western experience is radically different than the reality of the history of the West, just so you know. Basically, the West is, they sometimes talk about Mormon land. The West is a dry area. Everything west of the Mississippi at one point was known as the Great Desert. There are a few rivers. Remember, the wagon trains went along the Missouri River, because that's where water is. But basically, there's very little water west of the Mississippi. And the land and the plains were the original grasses that grow in the plains, are about this tall, and they're very, very tough until John Deere invents the heavy plow, and you have you don't farm there. This is not farmland. You got to have something that's why the sod busters. They mentioned the sod busters. Busting sod in the Midwest is not like farming in Pennsylvania. This is a much tougher situation. So you need to know a little basic geography about the West. Mostly, it's dry. It's very dry. Desert, steppe, or semi-arid. When you talk about the West, you basically, if you look at a map of precipitation, it's dry in the West. It's a semi-arid zone. It's a very different kind of geography. It's a geography, if any of you are familiar with if you're familiar with American history in the larger sense, the Spanish. The Spanish occupy Mexico, and it's a land of haciendas and silver mines. And the economy of the West are large ranches and mining. Just like you'd find in not so much farming. Like you'd find. Just by the way, population distribution, that's where you find all the Indians, that's where you find all the Chinese. The new immigrants, not. They go to the north. The whites, not so much. African Americans, obviously in the south. So when we look at different ethnic groups, obviously this is the home to Chinese, Indians, and white people, and not so much. Remember the new immigration, the Southern and Eastern Europeans. That's what we're talking about here. The new immigrants, they're not going to the West. They're going to where the jobs are. We have lots of pictures of people before, you have some pictures in your book by this guy. We have ethnographers who go out and interview Indian tribes, and that's one of the main sources of our knowledge about the Indian tribes. One of the problems with the frontier thesis is